The sun beat down mercilessly on Madeline Vance's cracked lips as she stumbled forward. Her once beautiful blue dress now tattered and stained with the red dust of the Arizona desert. 3 days without water had left her delirious, her throat so parched that each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. The mirage of water that had taunted her for miles disappeared again, replaced by endless waves of heat rising from the barren landscape. She collapsed to her knees, the world spinning around her as consciousness began to slip away. It was 1878, and Madeline had never imagined her journey west would end like this alone, and dying in a merciless wilderness that cared nothing for her dreams of a new beginning. In the distance, a plume of dust rose on the horizon. Had she been more lucid, she might have recognized it as a rider approaching, but as darkness closed in around her vision, Madeline could only slump forward into the burning sand, her final thought a prayer that death would come quickly. Hank Anderson had been tracking a stray from his herd when he spotted what looked like a heap of blue fabric against the desert floor. Curious, he nudged his horse forward, squinting against the harsh sunlight. As the distance closed, his eyes widened with shock. "Whoa there, Scout," he called to his horse, pulling back on the reins and dismounting with practiced ease. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud as he approached the fallen figure. A woman, and by the looks of it, not long for this world if he didn't act fast. Kneeling beside her, Hank gently turned her over. Her face was burned red from the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, but even in this state, he could see she was beautiful. Her chestnut hair, though tangled with dust and debris, framed a face that stirred something in him, a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" He reached for his canteen, uncorking it with his teeth. Cradling her head, he tipped a small amount of water between her lips, careful not to give her too much at once. "Easy now, just a little." Some primal survival instinct roused Madeline from unconsciousness. She felt the blessed coolness of water touching her lips and automatically swallowed, coughing weakly as her body remembered how to accept hydration. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of summer sage. "That's it," Hank encouraged, his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "Just a little more." Madeline's vision slowly cleared, and she found herself looking up into the face of a man silhouetted against the brutal sun. His features were shadowed beneath a worn leather hat, but she could make out the concern in his eyes, deep brown and steady as they assessed her condition. "Am I dead?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. A hint of a smile touched his sun-weathered face. "No, madam, not today at least." He offered the canteen again. "Small sips now." Madeline obeyed, each small swallow bringing her further back from the brink. As her senses returned, she became aware of the man's strong arms supporting her, the smell of leather, horse, and something uniquely male that spoke of open skies and freedom. "Thank you," she whispered when she could speak again. "I thought I was going to die out here. You nearly did." Hank's blunt assessment was softened by the gentleness of his touch as he helped her to sit up. "What in God's name is a lady like you doing out in the desert alone?" The question brought a flood of memories: the stagecoach, the robbery, being left behind when she'd wandered off to find privacy behind a rock. By the time she'd returned, the others had fled, thinking everyone was accounted for as they escaped the bandits. "The stagecoach," she managed. "Robbers came, they left without me." Hank's jaw tightened at the realization. "The Chambers gang heard they hit a coach 3 days back." He looked around at the barren landscape. "You've been wandering all this time," she nodded weakly. "I thought I could find my way to the next station." "That'd be Fort Willows," Hank said. "It's 30 miles east of here." He didn't need to tell her that she'd been walking in the wrong direction. Madeline closed her eyes, dizzy with the understanding of how close to death she'd truly come. "I don't even know your name," she murmured. "Hank Anderson." He tipped his hat slightly. "I run cattle about a day's ride from here. Madeline Vance." She attempted a smile which split her dry lips and made her wince. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Anderson, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Despite everything, Hank found himself chuckling at her formal introduction. This woman had been moments from death, yet she maintained her dignity and manners. It was oddly endearing. Well, Miss Vance, we need to get you out of this sun and properly tended to. He glanced at his horse, who stood patiently nearby. Think you can ride? Madeline considered her state weak, dizzy, and sore from head to toe. I'll try, that's all I ask. Hank stood and helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as she swayed dangerously. Easy now. It took all of Madeline's remaining strength to stay upright as Hank guided her to his horse. With careful movements, he helped her onto the saddle, then mounted behind her. His solid chest pressed against her back as he reached around to take the reins, creating a secure cage of muscle and sinew that made her feel inexplicably safe. Lean back if you need to, he said, his breath warm against her ear. I won't let you fall. Too exhausted to maintain propriety, Madeline allowed herself to relax against him, her head resting just beneath his chin. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her back was oddly comforting. My cabin's closer than town, Hank explained as he guided the horse forward. We'll get you there, get some food in you, and let you rest. Then we can figure out what to do next. Madeline nodded, her eyes drifting closed as the gentle rocking motion of the horse lulled her into a state between wakefulness and sleep. She should have been frightened, a lone woman in the company of a stranger, headed to his isolated cabin, but something about Hank Anderson inspired trust. Perhaps it was the careful way he'd given her water, or the respect in his voice when he spoke to her, or simply the fact that he'd stopped at all when many would have ridden past. As they rode, Hank kept a watchful eye on his unexpected charge. She was clearly from back east, her accent held hints of Boston or Philadelphia, and even in its current state, her dress spoke of quality and refinement. What had brought such a woman to the Arizona territory? He'd learned long ago not to ask too many questions about why people came west. Everyone had their reasons, and many preferred them kept private. The desert landscape gradually gave way to more varied terrain as they approached the foothills. Scrub brush and the occasional stunted tree offered brief patches of shade. Hank kept the pace steady, mindful of the precious cargo he carried. We're almost there, he said after they'd been riding for a couple of hours. Just over that rise. Madeline roused herself enough to look ahead. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the land. As they crested the hill, she saw a modest cabin nestled in a small valley. A corral stood to one side with several horses grazing peacefully, and a small creek glinted in the late afternoon light. It's beautiful, she murmured, surprised by the unexpected oasis. Hank felt an absurd surge of pride at her words. It ain't much, but it's home. As they approached, a black and white dog came bounding out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. That's Bandit, Hank explained. Don't worry, his bark is worse than his bite. They reached the cabin, and Hank dismounted first before reaching up to help Madeline down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, and he caught her against his chest, one arm around her waist. I'm sorry, she said, embarrassed by her weakness. Nothing to be sorry for, he replied, and before she could protest, he swept her into his arms and carried her toward the cabin door. Madeline knew she should object to such familiarity, but she lacked both the strength and, if she was honest with herself, the inclination. Instead, she let her head rest against his shoulder, inhaling the scent of him sun-warmed cotton, leather, and clean sweat. The cabin was simple but neat. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. A narrow doorway led to what she presumed was a bedroom. Everything was spare but functional, the mark of a man who lived alone and needed little. Hank carried her to a chair by the table and set her down gently. First things first, more water, but slowly. He filled a cup from a bucket and handed it to her. Small sips, remember? Madeline nodded, carefully drinking while Hank moved around the cabin with efficient movements, stoking the banked fire and putting a kettle on to heat. "I'm going to fix you something to eat, but we need to start simple," he explained. "Your stomach won't take kindly to a heavy meal after going empty for so long." As he worked, Madeline watched him, noticing details she'd missed before. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that spoke of years of physical labor. His face was tanned by the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes suggesting he smiled more often than not. His dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it escaped his hat, which he'd hung by the door upon entering. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, her voice stronger now that she'd had more water. Hank glanced over his shoulder as he stirred something in a pot. "Going on 8 years now, came west after the war like a lot of men did." "The Civil War?" she asked, realizing he was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his mid-30s. He nodded. "Served with the Union Army. Afterward didn't much feel like going back to Illinois." He shrugged. "Wanted open spaces and room to breathe." Madeline understood that feeling all too well. Wasn't that part of why she'd left Philadelphia? Though her reasons were more complicated than simply seeking open spaces. "I'm heading to San Francisco," she offered. "My aunt lives there." Hank brought over a bowl of thin broth and set it before her. "San Francisco's a fair piece from here. You planning to stay with your aunt?" Madeline nodded, carefully spooning the warm broth into her mouth. The simple flavor was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. "She has a boarding house for young ladies. I'm to help her run it." There was more to the story, much more, but Madeline wasn't ready to share those details with a stranger, kind as he might be. Her flight from Philadelphia had been precipitous and necessary, leaving behind a scandal that would have destroyed what remained of her family's good name. Hank seemed to sense her reticence and didn't press for more information. Instead, he busied himself preparing his own meal while she ate, giving her the space to regain her composure along with her strength. "The stage to Tucson comes through Fort Willows every Wednesday," he said after a while. "That's 3 days from now. You can catch it there, then connect to the line heading west." "Thank you," Madeline replied, setting down her empty bowl. The small amount of food had already made her feel more human. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Hank waved away her words. "No need. Anyone would have done the same." But they both knew that wasn't true. In this harsh country, many would have ridden past, unwilling to take on the burden of a half-dead woman they didn't know. "You should rest," Hank said, nodding toward the doorway that led to the bedroom. "You can take the bed, I'll sleep out here." Madeline started to protest, but exhaustion was overtaking her now that her immediate needs had been met. "Just for tonight," she conceded. "I've imposed enough as it is." Hank helped her to her feet, steadying her as she made her way to the bedroom. The room was as sparse as the rest of the cabin, a simple bed with a quilt, a small chest for clothing, and a basin and pitcher on a stand. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up," Hank said, hovering in the doorway. "I'll fetch your things from Scout's saddlebags." Madeline turned to thank him again, but was struck by a wave of dizziness. She swayed, and Hank was immediately at her side, his arm around her waist. "Easy," he murmured. "You've been through hell, Miss Vance. Your body needs time to recover." His face was close to hers, concern evident in his dark eyes. For a moment, something electric passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of something kindred in their spirits. Then Hank cleared his throat and stepped back, his hand lingering on her arm until he was certain she was steady. "Rest now," he said, his voice gruffer than before. "We'll talk more in the morning." After he left, closing the door behind him, Madeline sank onto the edge of the bed. Her mind was a whirl of confused emotions, gratitude, relief, and something else she wasn't quite ready to name. She poured water into the basin and used the cloth beside it to wash her face and hands, wincing at the tenderness of her sunburned skin. The simple act of cleansing away the desert's grime made her feel more like herself again. She removed her ruined dress, grimacing at the state of it, and slipped between the sheets in her chemise. The bed smelled of sunshine and a hint of tobacco, clean and distinctly masculine, like its owner. As exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, Madeline's last conscious thought was of Hank Anderson's steady hands as he'd helped her drink, and the unexpected safety she felt in the home of a man she'd known for less than a day. Outside, Hank sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood as the stars emerged overhead. Bandit lay at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the wooden planks. "What do you think, boy?" Hank asked quietly. "Quite a turn of events, ain't it?" The dog looked up at him with intelligent eyes that seemed to say he approved of their visitor. Hank chuckled and returned to his carving, trying not to think too much about the woman sleeping in his bed, or the strange feeling in his chest when she'd smiled at him like a long-forgotten door creaking open after years of disuse. He'd take her to Fort Willows in a few days, see her safely onto the stage, and that would be that. No sense in getting attached to someone who was just passing through. He'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago. Still, as he gazed up at the vast canopy of stars, Hank couldn't help wondering what twist of fate had brought Madeline Vance into his life, and why the thought of her continuing on her journey left him feeling oddly hollow. The morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the small window of the bedroom. Madeline woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then yesterday's events came flooding back: the desert, her near death, and the cowboy who had saved her life. She sat up, relieved to find her head clearer and her body stronger after a night's rest. The smell of coffee and something cooking drifted in from the main room, making her stomach growl appreciatively. She rose and poured fresh water into the basin, washing as best she could before donning her dress again. It was hopelessly wrinkled and stained, but it was all she had until she could retrieve her luggage if it hadn't been stolen along with everything else from the stagecoach. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped into the main room. Hank stood at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a pan. He'd shed his vest and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing corded forearms tanned by the sun. "Good morning," she said. He turned, a smile breaking across his face when he saw her. "Morning, how are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." She moved toward the table, still a bit unsteady but vastly improved from yesterday. "Whatever you're cooking smells wonderful." "Just some flapjacks and bacon," he said, sliding them onto a plate. "Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." He gestured for her to sit and place the plate before her, along with a cup of steaming coffee. Madeline couldn't remember the last time food had looked so appealing. "Thank you," she said again, feeling like she'd never be able to say those words enough to convey her gratitude. Hank served himself and sat across from her. "I was thinking," he said as they ate, "we should head into town today, get you some supplies before we make for Fort Willows." "Oh," Madeline said, setting down her fork, I'm afraid I have no money. The robbers took everything, my reticule, my luggage." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I can't impose on your generosity any further." Hank's expression softened. "Miss Vance, you nearly died out there. I'm not about to send you on your way without proper provisions." He took a sip of coffee. "Besides, I need to head into town anyway, got some business with the general store." Madeline wanted to protest, but the practicality of the situation won out. She needed supplies if she was to continue her journey, and right now, Hank Anderson was her only hope of acquiring them. "I'll repay you," she insisted. "Once I reach San Francisco, I'll send the money." Hank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "If it makes you feel better, you can write down your aunt's address, and I'll send a bill." The twinkle in his eye suggested he had no intention of doing any such thing. After breakfast, Hank went out to hitch the horses to his wagon while Madeline tidied up the cabin. It was the least she could do, and the familiar domestic task helped restore a sense of normalcy after her ordeal. When she stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the morning sun, she got her first good look at Hank's ranch in daylight. The small valley was prettier than she'd realized, green and lush compared to the desert she'd been lost in. The creek she'd glimpsed yesterday ran clear and inviting along the edge of the property, and beyond the corral, she could see a small herd of cattle grazing on a hillside. "It's lovely here," she said as Hank helped her up into the wagon. He glanced around as though seeing the place through her eyes. It serves me well enough. He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward. Town's about an hour's ride, not much to look at, but it has what we need. As they traveled, Madeline found herself relaxing in Hank's company. He was easy to talk to, with a dry humor that made her laugh despite the lingering discomfort of her sunburn. He told her about his ranch, how he'd started with just a few head of cattle and built it up over the years, how he preferred the solitude of the hills to the bustle of town, how Bandit had shown up as a half-starved pup and appointed himself guardian of the property. In return, she told him about Philadelphia, about growing up in a house full of books, about her dreams of seeing the Pacific Ocean. She carefully avoided mention of the circumstances that had forced her westward journey, and Hank, true to his nature, didn't pry. The town of Red Rock appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a wide main street. It wasn't much compared to the cities back east, but to Madeline, it looked like civilization after her time in the wilderness. "Sheriff's office," Hank said, pointing to a building as they drove in. "Might be worth stopping there first, report the robbery. Stage company might have some kind of compensation for passengers who have been robbed." Madeline nodded, though she doubted there would be much help forthcoming. Still, it was worth a try. They tied the horses outside the sheriff's office, and Hank helped Madeline down from the wagon. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and when their eyes met, she saw something flicker in his gaze that made her heart beat a little faster. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back, gesturing toward the door. Sheriff Thomas Wilson was a barrel-chested man with a graying mustache and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Madeline's account of the robbery with a grim expression. "Chambers' gang, all right," he confirmed when she'd finished. "They've been hitting stages between here and Tucson for months now, never leave witnesses usually." His eyes narrowed as he looked at her. "You're lucky you wandered off when you did, madam. And luckier still that Anderson here found you." "I'm well aware of my good fortune, Sheriff," Madeline replied, her hand unconsciously reaching for Hank's arm. The sheriff nodded, making some notes in a ledger. "Stage company has a policy they'll cover basic necessities for passengers who have been robbed. Won't replace valuables, mind you, but they'll get you where you're going with what you need." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a form. "Fill this out, take it to Jenkins at the general store. He'll set you up and bill the company." Relief washed over Madeline. At least she wouldn't be completely dependent on Hank's charity. She filled out the form, providing her name, the date of the robbery, and her intended destination. "Much obliged, Sheriff," Hank said as they prepared to leave. "Any word on when they might catch up to these outlaws?" Sheriff Wilson's expression darkened. "Got a posse out now, but those boys are slippery, know the territory too well." He sighed. "We'll get 'em eventually, always do." Their next stop was the general store, a large wooden building with a covered porch out front. Inside, shelves lined the walls filled with everything from tools and ammunition to fabric and medicines. Mr. Jenkins, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, examined the sheriff's form with careful attention. "Stage company policy covers basic traveling necessities," he explained. "One dress, undergarments, toiletries, and a valise to carry them." He eyed Madeline over his glasses. "Won't be fancy, mind you." "I don't need fancy, Mr. Jenkins," Madeline assured him. "Just something clean and serviceable." While Jenkins's wife helped Madeline select a modest gray traveling dress and the necessary undergarments, Hank busied himself gathering supplies for the ranch. By the time Madeline emerged from the back room, dressed in her new clothes and feeling considerably more presentable, he had a pile of goods on the counter. "Feeling better?" he asked, his eyes warming as they took in her transformed appearance. "Much," she replied, self-consciously smoothing down the skirt of her new dress. It was simple but well-made, with a high collar and practical long sleeves that would protect her already sunburned skin. Jenkins tallied up the purchases, separating Madeline's stage company covered items from Hank's personal supplies. As they prepared to leave, a commotion outside drew their attention. "That'll be the noon stage," Jenkins said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Right on time for once." Madeline and Hank stepped out onto the porch just as the stagecoach rumbled down the main street, dust billowing in its wake. It came to a halt outside the hotel across the way, passengers disembarking stiffly after the rough journey. "We could inquire about your luggage," Hank suggested. "If they found it after the robbery." Madeline nodded, and they crossed the street to where the stage driver was unloading bags from the roof. "Excuse me," Hank called. "The lady here was on the stage that got robbed 3 days back. Any chance her luggage was recovered?" The driver, a weathered man with a thick beard, looked Madeline up and down. "You the one they thought was taken by the gang?" Madeline blinked in surprise. "Taken? No, I wandered away for a moment of privacy, and when I returned, everyone was gone." The driver spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Way I heard it, the passengers said one lady went missing during the robbery. Company figured the gang took you." He shook his head. "Glad to see you're all right, madam." "My luggage," Madeline pressed. "If it was marked with your name, it might be at the depot in Tucson. They gather up anything left after robberies, hold it for claiming." He tipped his hat. "You can check when you get there." As they walked back to the wagon, Madeline felt a curious mix of emotions. The idea that she'd been presumed kidnapped or worse while she wandered the desert alone was sobering. Had the stage company even bothered to look for her? "You all right?" Hank asked quietly, noticing her troubled expression. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't found me." Hank's gaze was steady and reassuring. "But I did find you. That's what matters." They loaded their purchases into the wagon and made one more stop at the telegraph office, where Madeline sent a wire to her aunt in San Francisco, explaining the delay in her arrival and assuring her she was safe. As they drove out of town, Madeline felt lighter than she had in days. The new clothes, the telegram to her aunt, the sheriff's report, all small steps toward regaining control of her journey. Yet beneath this newfound optimism was an unsettling awareness that she was growing attached to the quiet, steady man beside her. In just over a day, Hank Anderson had gone from stranger to rescuer to what? Friend seemed too casual a term for the man who had saved her life. But anything more seemed presumptuous given the brevity of their acquaintance and the certainty that they would soon part ways. "Penny for your thoughts," Hank said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Madeline smiled, grateful for the interruption of her confusing musings. "I was just thinking how strange life is. A week ago I was in St. Louis, certain of my path. Now here I am in a place I never expected to be with." She hesitated. "With someone I never expected to meet." Hank's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Life has a way of throwing surprises at us, some good, some not so good." "And which am I?" Madeline asked before she could stop herself. Hank glanced at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Definitely one of the good ones, Miss Vance." The rest of the ride back to the ranch passed in companionable conversation, the air between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name. When they arrived, Bandit greeted them enthusiastically, circling the wagon and barking his welcome. "He's happy to see you," Hank observed as he helped Madeline down. "The feeling is mutual," she replied, kneeling to scratch the dog's ears. "He's a handsome fellow." Hank watched the interaction with a softening in his eyes. Seeing Madeline with Bandit at ease on his property stirred feelings he'd long thought buried. She fit here, somehow, in a way that made the cabin feel more like a home than it had in years. The rest of the day passed in domestic harmony. Madeline insisted on helping prepare dinner, and they worked side by side in the small kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that belied their short acquaintance. After the meal, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. "It's beautiful here," Madeline said softly, "so different from Philadelphia." "What was it like growing up in a big city?" Hank asked, genuinely curious. Madeline considered the question. Crowded, noisy, always something happening. She smiled at a memory. My father was a professor at the university. Our house was full of books and ideas and debates. He believed women should be educated just like men. Smart man, Hank commented. Yes, he was. A shadow crossed her face. He died last year, pneumonia. I'm sorry, Hank said, his voice gentle. Madeline nodded, appreciating the simple sincerity of his condolence. After he died, things changed. She didn't elaborate, and Hank didn't press. My Aunt Harriet, my mother's sister, wrote offering me a place in San Francisco. It seemed like a good time for a fresh start. San Francisco's a fine city from what I hear, Hank said, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. Have you been there? Madeline asked. He shook his head. Never made it past Tucson, truth be told. Got as far as there after the war, saw this country, and knew I'd found where I belonged. Madeline studied his profile in the fading light, understanding suddenly that Hank Anderson was a man who had found his place in the world, a rare thing indeed. She envied him that certainty, that sense of belonging. What about you? He asked, turning to catch her watching him. Think you'll find what you're looking for in San Francisco? The question caught her off guard. What was she looking for? Escape, certainly, safety, a new beginning. But beyond that, I hope so, she said finally. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I hope I recognize it when I find it. Hank nodded, as though her vague answer made perfect sense to him. Perhaps it did. Perhaps he understood the searching better than most. As darkness fell, they reluctantly moved inside. Once again, Hank insisted Madeline take the bedroom while he made do with a bedroll by the fire. This time, her protests were less emphatic, her body still recovering from her ordeal in the desert. In the privacy of the bedroom, Madeline changed into the nightgown Mrs. Jenkins had included with her new clothes. As she brushed out her hair with the comb from the small toiletry kit, she found herself thinking about Hank, his kindness, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She was leaving the day after tomorrow. This interlude, pleasant as it was, would soon be nothing more than a memory as she continued her journey west. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. Outside, Hank lay on his bedroll, staring up at the ceiling, sleep eluding him despite the long day. He could hear the soft sounds of Madeline moving about in his bedroom, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric. Tomorrow would be their last full day together before he took her to Fort Willows to catch the stage. The realization sat heavy in his chest. He'd grown accustomed to her presence in his home with alarming speed. Her laugh, her thoughtful questions, the way she noticed and appreciated the beauty of his land, all had wormed their way past defenses he'd thought impenetrable. But she was bound for San Francisco and a life with her aunt. A life far removed from cattle and dust and the solitude of the Arizona hills. And he was. Well, he was exactly where he wanted to be. Wasn't he? Hank rolled onto his side, punching his pillow into submission. No sense in dwelling on what couldn't be. Tomorrow he'd show her the best of his ranch, give her a day to remember on her journey west. Then he'd see her safely onto the stage and return to the life he'd built for himself. If that life suddenly seemed a bit emptier than before, well, that was just something he'd have to get used to again. Morning dawned with a cloudless sky promising another beautiful day. Madeline woke early, feeling more rested and rejuvenated than she had in weeks. The lingering effects of her desert ordeal were fading, replaced by a vibrant energy that surprised her. She dressed quickly in her new clothes, eager to make the most of her last full day at the ranch. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Hank already up, coffee brewing on the stove. Morning, he greeted her, a smile warming his features. Sleep well. Very, she replied, returning his smile. The desert air agrees with me, it seems. Thought we might ride out to the north pasture today, Hank said as he poured her a cup of coffee. It's where I keep the best of my breeding stock. Pretty country, too. Madeline accepted the cup gratefully. That sounds wonderful. Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a rider. Hank's eyes twinkled. Don't worry, Scout's gentle as a lamb. He'll take good care of you. After breakfast, they headed to the corral where Hank saddled Scout for Madeline and a spirited bay mare named Ruby for himself. With patient guidance, he helped Madeline mount and adjusted her stirrups. "Just relax," he advised, his hand lingering on her knee as he made a final adjustment. "Scout knows what to do, you just need to stay balanced and enjoy the ride." The touch of his hand sent a warm current through her, even through the fabric of her dress. Their eyes met briefly, and Madeline saw her own awareness reflected in his gaze before he turned away to mount his own horse. They set out at an easy pace, Hank leading the way along a trail that wound through the hills. Scout, true to Hank's promise, proved to be a steady mount, responding to the slightest guidance from the reins. As they rode, Hank pointed out features of the landscape: the creek that provided water for his cattle year-round, the rock formations that marked the boundaries of his property, the distant mountains that changed color with the shifting light. "How much land do you own?" Madeline asked, impressed by the vastness of it all. "About 3,000 acres, Hank replied. "Not as big as some spreads, but it's good land, enough water, enough grass, enough shelter from the worst storms." They crested a rise and Madeline gasped at the view that opened before them. A wide valley stretched below, dotted with grazing cattle. A natural spring created a small pond at the center, surrounded by cottonwood trees offering shade in the desert heat. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Best part of the ranch," Hank agreed, pride evident in his voice. "Come winter, this valley holds the snow longer, keeps the grass growing when other pastures go dormant." They dismounted near the pond, and Hank spread a blanket in the shade of a large cottonwood. From his saddlebags, he produced a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried fruit. "A picnic," Madeline said, delighted by the gesture. "Seemed like a good day for it." Hank's casual tone belied the thoughtfulness of the arrangement. They ate amid comfortable conversation, sharing stories of their respective lives. Hank told her about growing up in Illinois, about joining the Union Army at 18, about the nightmares that had driven him west after the war ended. "Needed space," he explained, looking out over the valley. "Couldn't breathe back east after what I'd seen. Too many ghosts." Madeline nodded, understanding more than he might have expected. "Sometimes a fresh start is the only way forward." "Is that what you're looking for in San Francisco?" Hank asked, his eyes searching hers. "A fresh start." Madeline hesitated, then decided that after all he'd done for her, he deserved some honesty. "Yes, after my father died, my mother's cousin Edwin took control of our finances. He had expectations of me that I couldn't meet." Hank's expression darkened. "What kind of expectations?" "Marriage," Madeline said simply. "To him. He was a widower, 20 years my senior, with a reputation for cruelty that he hid behind a veneer of respectability." She plucked at a blade of grass, avoiding Hank's gaze. "When I refused, he began spreading rumors about my character. Said I'd been seen with men of questionable reputation, that my refusal of his suit was proof of my moral failing." "Bastard," Hank muttered. Madeline smiled grimly. "Indeed. In Philadelphia society, a woman's reputation is her most valuable possession. Once tarnished, it can never be fully restored," she shrugged. "So when my aunt wrote offering me a place with her, I seized the opportunity. Edwin couldn't stop me without revealing that he'd lost control of his ward, which his pride wouldn't allow." Hank was quiet for a long moment, digesting her story. "I'm sorry you had to leave your home like that." "I'm not," Madeline replied, surprising herself with the realization. "If I hadn't, I'd never have seen all this." She gestured to the landscape around them. "Never have experienced the real West, beyond the dime novels and sensational newspaper accounts. Never have almost died in the desert," Hank added wryly. Madeline laughed. "Well, I could have done without that part, but then again." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I wouldn't have met you." The words hung between them, charged with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Hank's eyes dropped to her lips, and for a heartbeat, Madeline thought he might lean in, close the distance between them. Instead, he cleared his throat and stood. "We should head back," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Got chores to see to before sundown. The ride back to the cabin was quieter, both lost in thoughts of what had almost happened by the pond and the impending separation that loomed ahead. When they reached the corral, Hank helped Madeline dismount, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her down. For a moment, he didn't let go, and they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, see the pulse beating in his throat. "Thank you for today," she said softly. Hank nodded, finally stepping back. "My pleasure, Miss Vance." The formality stung a little after the intimacy they'd shared, but Madeline understood it for what it was, a reminder of the temporary nature of their connection. The evening passed in preparations for the next day's journey to Fort Willows. Hank checked the wagon, oiled the leather harnesses, and made sure everything was ready for an early departure. Madeline packed her few belongings in the new valise Mr. Jenkins had provided, trying not to think about how final each action felt. After dinner, they sat on the porch again, the night air cool around them. Bandit lay at Madeline's feet, his head resting on her shoe as though trying to anchor her in place. "He's going to miss you," Hank said, watching the dog's obvious attachment. "And I him," Madeline replied, reaching down to stroke Bandit's ears. "I'll miss all of this." The admission slipped out before she could censor it. Hank was quiet for a long moment. "You could stay," he finally said, the words hanging in the night air between them. Madeline's heart skipped a beat. "Stay," Hank turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I know it's forward of me. We've only known each other a few days, but I can't help feeling there's something here worth exploring." He gestured between them. "Between us." Madeline's breath caught in her throat. Part of her had been hoping he'd say exactly this, while another part had feared it. "Hank, you don't have to decide right now," he hurried on. "Come with me to Fort Willows tomorrow. If you still want to get on that stage to Tucson, I won't try to stop you, but if you want to come back here, see where this might lead." He left the sentence unfinished, the offer hanging between them. Madeline's mind raced. The attraction between them was undeniable, but was it enough to change the course she'd set for herself? She barely knew him, yet felt she understood him in ways that defied rational explanation. And there was her aunt to consider. Harriet was expecting her, had arranged everything for her arrival. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is all so unexpected." Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's fair. Like I said, no pressure to decide now." He stood, offering her his hand. "It's getting late. We should turn in if we want to reach Fort Willows by noon tomorrow." Madeline allowed him to help her up, the simple contact of his hand around hers sending a flutter through her stomach. At the bedroom door, she paused, looking back at him. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for saving my life, but for everything since." Hank's smile was gentle in the dim light of the cabin. "Good night, Madeline." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips made her heart leap. "Good night, Hank." In the bedroom, Madeline changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts in turmoil. Stay or go? Continue to San Francisco as planned, or take a chance on a man she'd known less than 3 days? It was madness to even consider staying. Yet the thought of climbing onto that stagecoach tomorrow, of watching Hank Anderson fade into the distance as her journey continued without him, filled her with a sense of loss so acute it was almost physical. She lay back against the pillows, staring at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. Tomorrow she would have to choose the safe path to her aunt's home in San Francisco, or the unknown terrain of a life with Hank in the Arizona hills. As she drifted toward sleep, Madeline realized with startling clarity that for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt truly alive. Not just surviving, but vibrant and present in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Whatever her decision tomorrow, she would be grateful to Hank Anderson for awakening that feeling in her again. Outside, Hank sat by the dying fire, Bandit curled at his feet. He hadn't planned to speak those words tonight, hadn't even fully acknowledged to himself how quickly and completely Madeline Vance had worked her way under his skin. Yet once said, he couldn't bring himself to regret them. There was something rare and precious between them, a connection that transcended the brevity of their acquaintance. He'd felt it from the moment she'd opened her eyes in the desert, looking up at him with a mixture of fear and hope that had stirred something long dormant in his soul. Would she stay? The practical part of him doubted it. She was educated, refined, used to city comforts. What could he offer her here that would compare to the life awaiting her in San Francisco? Yet he'd seen her marvel at the beauty of his land, watched her face light up as they rode through the hills, felt her lean into him as they sat side by side on the porch. There was a part of her that responded to this place, to the life he'd built here. A part that might be willing to take a chance on an Arizona rancher with little to his name beyond cattle and land, and a heart he'd thought closed off to love. Tomorrow would tell. For tonight, Hank could only hope and prepare himself for either outcome. He banked the fire and stretched out on his bedroll, Bandit sighing contentedly beside him. "What do you think, boy?" he whispered to the dog. "Think she might stay?" Bandit's tail thumped against the floor once, twice a sound of canine optimism that made Hank smile despite his uncertainty. Whatever happened tomorrow, he'd made the right choice in asking. Some chances were worth taking, even if they ended in disappointment. Madeline Vance was definitely one of those chances. Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed fitting for a day of decision. Madeline dressed with care in her new traveling outfit, her few possessions neatly packed in the valise. When she emerged from the bedroom, Hank was already up, coffee brewed and a simple breakfast waiting on the table. "Morning," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her travel-ready appearance with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sleep well?" "Not really," she admitted, setting her valise by the door. "Too much on my mind." Hank nodded, understanding in his gaze. "No rush to talk about it. Let's eat first." They shared breakfast in companionable silence, the weight of the impending decision hanging between them. When they'd finished, Hank cleared the dishes while Madeline took one last look around the cabin, committing it to memory. "I'll go hitch up the wagon," Hank said, heading for the door. "I'll help," Madeline replied, following him outside. The morning was beautiful, the sky a deep azure with just a few wispy clouds. The air was cool but promised warmth as the day progressed. Bandit raced around the yard, seemingly unaware of the tension between the humans. They worked together to prepare for the journey, loading supplies and securing Madeline's valise. The domestic familiarity of the task made her heart ache with what might have been. Finally, everything was ready. Hank helped Madeline up onto the wagon seat, then rounded to the other side and took his place beside her. With a click of his tongue and a gentle flick of the reins, they set off toward Fort Willows. For the first mile or so, they rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Hank cleared his throat. "Whatever you decide," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead, "I want you to know these past few days have meant a lot to me." Madeline looked at his profile, strong and steady against the backdrop of the hills. "They've meant a lot to me too, Hank." He glanced at her then, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Yeah," she nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "More than I expected, more than makes sense, really, given how brief our acquaintance has been." "Some things don't need time to be real," Hank said quietly. "Sometimes you just know." The simplicity and truth of his words resonated within her. Sometimes you just know. Wasn't that what she'd felt, sitting with him on the porch, riding beside him through the hills, working alongside him in the kitchen? What would it look like? She asked, the question slipping out before she could second-guess herself. "If I stayed, I mean." Hank's hands tightened on the reins, the only outward sign of the significance of her query. "Well," he began, considering his words carefully, "at first, you'd stay in the cabin. I'd bunk in the lean-to out back until we—" He hesitated. "Until we decided if this was something permanent." "And if it was," Madeline pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what he was offering. Hank's expression softened. "Then I reckon we'd make it official. There's a preacher comes through Fort Willows once a month. After that, we'd build the cabin up proper, add another bedroom or two." A hint of color touched his cheeks. "For the future, if that's something you wanted." Children, Madeline said, understanding his meaning. He nodded. If you wanted them. No rush on any of it. We'd take the time to know each other better, make sure this feeling between us is as real as it seems. Madeline considered his words, appreciating the respect and consideration inherent in them. No demands, no expectations beyond giving their connection a chance to grow. And what would I do here? She asked. I'm not much of a rancher's wife, Hank smiled. You'd learn what you wanted to learn, help with the books, maybe I'm no hand with figures, garden if that's to your liking. The women in town have a lending library they've set up in the church basement. You mentioned your father was a professor, maybe you'd want to teach some of the local children. The image he painted was unexpectedly appealing, a life of purpose and community, grounded in this beautiful land with a man who saw her as a partner rather than a possession. It wouldn't be easy, Hank continued honestly. Ranching has its hard years along with the good ones. Whether cattle prices, 1,000 things beyond our control, he glanced at her. It's not the life you're used to. The life I'm used to wasn't making me happy, Madeline admitted. That's why I left. They fell silent again as the wagon rolled on, the landscape gradually changing as they approached Fort Willows. In the distance, Madeline could see the outline of buildings taking shape against the horizon. We'll be there in about half an hour, Hank said, his tone carefully neutral. Stage usually comes through around 1 o'clock. Madeline nodded, her heart racing as the moment of decision drew nearer. Stay or go? Safety and certainty in San Francisco, or risk and possibility here with Hank? She thought of her Aunt Harriet, waiting for her arrival. The woman had been kind to offer her a home, but they barely knew each other. The boarding house position was more charity than necessity. Harriet had plenty of help already. And then there was Edwin and the scandal she'd left behind. Would running all the way to San Francisco truly erase that stain, or would she simply be trading one form of exile for another? Here, with Hank, she could build something new. Something honest and real, based not on societal expectations, but on the genuine connection they'd forged in these few short days. It was madness. It was impulsive. It went against everything her proper upbringing had taught her about caution and propriety. Yet as Fort Willows grew larger in the distance, Madeline found herself filled with a certainty that surprised her with its intensity. Hank, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, I think I'd like to send another telegram to my aunt. He looked at her sharply, hope warring with caution in his expression. Oh, Madeline smiled, the last of her doubts falling away as she met his gaze. Yes, to tell her I've had a change of plans, that I've found where I belong. The joy that bloomed across Hank's face was like sunrise breaking over the hills, gradual at first, then radiant with uncontained happiness. He reined the horses to a stop, turning to face her fully. You mean it? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. You'll stay. I'll stay, Madeline confirmed, her own smile growing to match his. I can't promise I'll be any good at ranching, but I want to try. I want to see where this leads. This thing between us that doesn't make any logical sense but feels more right than anything has in a very long time. Hank reached for her then, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Madeline Vance, he said softly, I've been waiting for you my whole life without even knowing it. And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and certain against hers, and Madeline was kissing him back, her arms winding around his neck as something like coming home unfurled within her chest. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Hank rested his forehead against hers. I should probably tell you, he said, a smile in his voice. Bandit snores something awful in the summer heat. Madeline laughed, joy bubbling up from some deep wellspring inside her. I'll keep that in mind. They continued on to Fort Willows, the wagon lighter somehow despite carrying the same load. In town, Hank waited while Madeline sent her telegram to Aunt Harriet, explaining her change of plans in terms that were honest but reassuring. She promised to write a longer letter soon, detailing the extraordinary circumstances that had led to her decision. Next, they visited the general store, purchasing additional supplies that Madeline would need for a longer stay: fabric for new clothes, some books, cooking utensils to supplement Hank's bachelor collection. The storekeeper's wife raised an eyebrow at the domestic nature of their purchases, but asked no questions beyond offering congratulations that seemed to encompass more than just Madeline's rescue from the desert. By the time the stage rolled into town, Madeline and Hank were loading their purchases into the wagon, ready to head back to the ranch, their ranch now, in a way that filled Madeline with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since before her father's death. As the passengers disembarked, dusty and travel-worn, Madeline caught the eye of a young woman about her age who was preparing to board for the journey west. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of parallel lives diverging at this dusty crossroads. "Ready to go home?" Hank asked, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. Home. The word resonated within her, filling spaces she hadn't known were empty. "Yes," Madeline replied, placing her hand in his. "I'm ready to go home." The journey back to the ranch was filled with conversation about the future plans for expanding the cabin, ideas for a small garden plot, discussions of how Madeline might involve herself in the community of Red Rock. With each mile that passed, her certainty grew, the rightness of her decision confirming itself in ways both large and small. Bandit was overjoyed to see them return together, racing circles around the wagon as they pulled up to the cabin. As Hank helped Madeline down, the dog bounded up, placing his front paws on her skirt in greeting. "Down, boy," Hank scolded, though his tone lacked any real admonishment. "That's no way to treat a lady." Madeline laughed, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. "It's all right. I think he's just happy I came back." "That makes two of us," Hank said softly. Their eyes met, and the connection between them hummed like a plucked guitar string, vibrant and true. Impulsively, Madeline rose and kissed him, a quick, joyful press of lips that left them both smiling. "Let's get these supplies inside," Hank said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Then I'll show you the rest of the ranch, the parts we didn't get to yesterday." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity and discovery. Hank proudly showed Madeline every aspect of the operation: the small but efficient barn, the corral where he broke new horses, the spring-fed irrigation system he designed himself. With each revelation, Madeline's appreciation for what he'd built here grew, along with her determination to become a true partner in maintaining and expanding it. As sunset painted the hills in gold and crimson, they sat on the porch, shoulders touching as they watched the light fade. Bandit lay at their feet, occasionally sighing in contentment. "Any regrets?" Hank asked quietly. Madeline considered the question seriously, searching her heart for any hint of doubt or hesitation. She found none. "No," she replied honestly. "It's strange, I've always been the cautious one, the planner. This is the most impulsive thing I've ever done, yet it feels like the most right." Hank's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. "I'm glad," he said simply. They sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared overhead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments as they learned to share space and life. But tonight, in this moment, everything was as it should be. "Tell me something I don't know about you yet," Madeline said, breaking the silence. Hank thought for a moment. "I can play the harmonica, not well, mind you, but enough to recognize a tune." Madeline smiled. "I'd like to hear that sometime." "Your turn," he prompted. "I can bake a cherry pie that would make you weep," she replied. "My mother taught me. It was the one domestic skill she insisted I master." "I look forward to trying it," Hank said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "What else?" They traded small revelations as night deepened around them: favorite books, childhood memories, hopes for the future. Each disclosure was another thread in the tapestry they were beginning to weave together, colorful and strong. When the night air grew cool, they moved inside, reluctant to end the perfect day but aware of the propriety they'd agreed to maintain until their relationship was formalized. Hank built up the fire while Madeline prepared a light supper from their supplies. As they ate, plans for the coming weeks took shape between them. Hank would begin work on expanding the lean-to into proper sleeping quarters for himself until they could be married. Madeline would accompany him to Red Rock on Sunday to attend church services and be introduced to the community. They would write to her aunt together, providing her with a fuller explanation and inviting her to visit once they were settled. After the meal, Hank gathered his bedroll and a few personal items. "I'll sleep in the lean-to tonight," he said, a hint of regret in his voice despite the rightness of the decision. Madeline nodded, understanding the importance of this boundary they'd set. There would be time enough for greater intimacy once their union was blessed. At the door, Hank paused, turning back to her. "Madeline," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips, "I want you to know I'll spend every day trying to make sure you never regret the choice you made today." She crossed to him, reaching up to touch his face. "I know you will. And I'll do the same." Their goodnight kiss was tender and full of promise, a pledge of days to come, a life to be built together. Later, alone in the bedroom that would soon be theirs to share, Madeline stood by the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. 3 days ago, she'd been lost and dying in the desert, certain her journey had come to a tragic end before it had truly begun. Now she stood on the threshold of a life she'd never imagined, but already couldn't picture living without. A life with Hank Anderson in this beautiful, wild corner of Arizona territory. "Thank you," she whispered to whatever fate or providence had led her here. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Madeline Vance felt truly, completely at home. 1 month later, the small church in Fort Willows was filled to capacity as the community gathered to witness the union of Hank Anderson and Madeline Vance. Word of their unusual courtship had spread throughout the territory, taking on the quality of legend, with each retelling the Eastern lady lost in the desert, the rancher who found her just in time, the love that bloomed against all odds. Madeline stood at the back of the church, her arm linked with Sheriff Wilson's. In the absence of her father, the sheriff had offered to give her away, a kindness that had brought tears to her eyes when he'd proposed it. "Nervous?" Wilson asked, patting her hand where it rested on his arm. Madeline smiled, glancing down at the simple white dress she wore, not as elaborate as she might have chosen in Philadelphia, but perfect for this day, this place, this man she was about to marry. "Not at all," she replied truthfully. "I've never been more certain of anything." The small organ began to play, and the congregation rose, turning to watch as Madeline made her way down the aisle. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Hank, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The love that shone in his eyes as he watched her approach made her heart swell with joy. The past month had been one of discovery and delight as they learned each other's habits, preferences, and quirks. Each day had only confirmed what they'd both sensed from the beginning, that what they'd found together was rare and precious. Reaching the altar, Madeline took Hank's outstretched hand, the warmth and strength of his grip anchoring her in the moment. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Henry James Anderson and Madeline Elizabeth Vance in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple but meaningful, their vows spoken with clear voices and full hearts. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Hank's kiss was both tender and possessive, a perfect balance that made Madeline's knees weak with anticipation of the night to come. The celebration afterward, held in the town hall, was joyous and lively. The women of Red Rock had outdone themselves with the feast, and someone had brought a fiddle, leading to impromptu dancing that continued well into the evening. Madeline, cheeks flushed from dancing and happiness, found herself momentarily alone as Hank was pulled into a conversation with neighboring ranchers. Mrs. Jenkins, the storekeeper's wife, appeared at her side, offering a cup of punch. "You've caused quite a stir in our little community," the older woman said with a smile. Hank Anderson married, most had given up hope of that ever happening. Madeline accepted the punch gratefully. Was he considered such a confirmed bachelor? Mrs. Jenkins nodded. Since he came here after the war, kept to himself mostly, though always pleasant and well-respected. She studied Madeline with kind eyes. Whatever brought you two together, it was meant to be. I haven't seen him this happy, well, ever. Warmth spread through Madeline's chest at the words. I feel the same way. You'll do well here, Mrs. Jenkins declared with the certainty of long experience. You've got the right spirit for it, adaptable but steady, and you love the land already. I can see it in your eyes when you talk about the ranch. It was true, Madeline realized. In just a month, she'd come to love the hills and valleys of their property, the way the light changed throughout the day, the rhythm of life dictated by the needs of the cattle and the seasons rather than society's arbitrary schedules. Thank you, she said sincerely. That means a lot, coming from you. As the celebration continued around them, Madeline found her gaze drawn to her husband, who was now engaged in a lively discussion with Sheriff Wilson. Husband. The word still felt new and wonderful, a reminder of all that had changed in the short weeks since she'd awakened in the desert to find Hank Anderson offering her water and hope. Eventually, the time came for the newlyweds to depart. They'd decided to spend their wedding night at the small hotel in Fort Willows before returning to the ranch the following day. Amid cheers and well wishes, they climbed into the decorated wagon that would take them the short distance to the hotel. Happy, Mrs. Anderson? Hank asked as they pulled away from the town hall, his arms secure around her shoulders. Madeline leaned into him, savoring the sound of her new name. Completely, Mr. Anderson. The hotel room was simple but clean, with a large bed that dominated the space. Once alone, a momentary shyness fell between them, a recognition of the threshold they were about to cross. Hank closed the distance between them, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. I love you, Madeline, he said, the words flowing easily now after weeks of growing certainty. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And I love you, she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. I'm so grateful fate brought me to your doorstep, even if it took nearly dying in the desert to get there. His laugh was soft against her lips as he kissed her, the last barriers between them falling away as they surrendered to the love that had drawn them together against all odds. Later, as moonlight streamed through the window, Madeline lay in the circle of Hank's arms, her body humming with newfound knowledge and satisfaction. His heartbeat was strong and steady beneath her cheek, his breathing deep and even in sleep. She thought of the journey that had brought her here from the sheltered drawing rooms of Philadelphia to this moment of perfect contentment in a small hotel in the Arizona Territory. Not the path she'd envisioned for herself, but unquestionably the right one. Tomorrow they would return to the ranch, to the home they would build together, the life they would forge side by side. There would be challenges ahead, she knew. Drought years and harsh winters, the isolation of ranch life, the adjustments of two independent souls learning to move as one. But as Hank stirred beside her, pulling her closer even in sleep, Madeline knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. She had been lost and he had found her, and in sharing everything, his water, his home, his heart, he had given her not just life, but a reason to live it fully. Outside, the vast desert stretched under star-filled skies, beautiful and deadly and full of possibilities. Inside, in the warmth of her husband's embrace, Madeline Anderson closed her eyes and slept, secure in the knowledge that she had found her true home at last. 5 years later, the Anderson Ranch had flourished beyond either Hank or Madeline's expectations. The small cabin had expanded into a proper house with 3 bedrooms, a study lined with books, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The cattle operation had grown, necessitating the hiring of 2 full-time hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the corral. But the greatest joy of all was the sound of children's laughter that filled the house. 4-year-old James, named for Hank's father, and 2-year-old Elizabeth, called Libby, who had her mother's sage green eyes and her father's determined spirit. On a warm spring morning, Madeline stood at the kitchen window, watching as Hank taught James to gentle a new foal, the boy's small hand guided by his father's larger one as they offered an apple to the nervous animal. Libby played nearby, supervised by Bandit, now gray around the muzzle but still devoted to his family. The scene brought a smile to Madeline's face and a hand to her stomach, where a third child was just beginning to make its presence known. She hadn't told Hank yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. Tonight, she decided. Tonight, after the children were asleep, she would tell him they would need to prepare the third bedroom sooner than planned. A rider appeared on the horizon, and Madeline recognized the silhouette of Sheriff Wilson. He came by every few weeks, ostensibly to discuss town business with Hank, who had been elected to the town council the previous year. But really, she suspected, for the pie and conversation. She moved to the door, waving as the sheriff approached. "Thomas, perfect timing, I just took an apple pie out of the oven." The sheriff dismounted with a grin. "Woman, you're going to be the death of my waistline." He tipped his hat. "Morning, Madeline, ranch is looking mighty fine." "It's the rain we've had this spring," she replied, though pride colored her voice. "Everything's growing like it's trying to make up for last year's drought." Hank approached with James on his shoulders, Libby toddling behind with Bandit's assistance. "Sheriff," he greeted, extending a hand. "What brings you out our way?" "Partly your wife's pie," Wilson admitted with a chuckle. "But also some news you'll want to hear. Chambers' gang was caught trying to rob a bank in Yuma. Got themselves shot up pretty bad in the attempt." Madeline and Hank exchanged a look of surprise. After all this time, the outlaws who had inadvertently changed the course of their lives had finally met justice. "All of them?" Hank asked. Wilson nodded. "Every last one. Thought you'd want to know, considering." He glanced at Madeline. "Thank you, Thomas," she said sincerely. "It's good to have that chapter closed completely." The sheriff joined them for lunch, entertaining the children with stories while enjoying 2 generous slices of Madeline's pie. When he departed, promising to return for the town council meeting the following week, Hank and Madeline stood on the porch watching him ride away. "Hard to believe it's been 5 years," Hank said, his arm around her waist. Madeline leaned into him, savoring the familiar comfort of his embrace. "The best 5 years of my life." He kissed the top of her head, inhaling the lavender scent of her hair. "Mine too, by a country mile." That evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Madeline and Hank sat on the porch as they often did, watching the sunset paint the hills in hues of gold and amber. "I got a letter from Aunt Harriet today," Madeline said, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "She's planning to visit again this summer. Says she can't bear another year without seeing how much the children have grown." Hank smiled. Harriet's first visit, shortly after James was born, had transformed her from a skeptical city woman dubious of her niece's impulsive marriage to a devoted great-aunt who sent packages of books and toys from San Francisco with regularity. "We'll have to clean out the guest room," he noted. "It's become a bit of a storage area since Christmas." Madeline took a deep breath, seizing the opening. "Actually, I was thinking we might want to move some of those things to the third bedroom soon, make space." Hank looked at her quizzically, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Madeline, are you saying?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "In the fall. Late October, the doctor thinks." With a whoop of joy that startled Bandit from his doze, Hank lifted her from her chair and spun her in a circle, his laughter mingling with hers in the twilight air. "Another baby," he marveled, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "I'm the luckiest man alive." Madeline gazed up at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than one, whose love had given her a home, a family, a purpose. "We're both lucky," she corrected gently. "To have found each other against all odds." Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Hank's hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, Madeline reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate thirst of the desert to the abundance of their life together, a metaphor so perfect it almost seemed designed. "What are you thinking about?" Hank murmured, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "About how sometimes being lost is the only way to be found," she replied, nestling closer to his warmth. "And how sharing everything can multiply it rather than divide it." Hank's arm tightened around her. "Wise words, Mrs. Anderson. I had a good teacher, Mr. Anderson." As they drifted towards sleep, the sounds of their home surrounded them, the gentle breathing of their children down the hall, Bandit's soft snoring from his spot by the door, the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods by the creek. Once, Madeline had thought her life's path led inevitably to San Francisco and a future prescribed by duty and circumstance. Instead, a twist of fate and a brush with death had brought her here to a life richer and more fulfilling than any she could have imagined. She had been lost in the desert without food or water. Hank had found her just in time and shared everything. And in that sharing, they had both found something neither knew. They were searching for a love as vast and enduring as the land they called home.